My parents believed my sister's lies until her story broke in front of everyone. I never thought that sentence would describe a single Sunday in my life, but that's literally what yesterday felt like from the moment I woke up and saw my phone blowing up with missed calls and long texts from my mom. I'm 32, my name's Ryan, and I live about 40 minutes outside of Cleveland in a small apartment that still smells like the cheap curry from the restaurant downstairs, especially in the mornings when the vents kick on. I was sitting at my tiny kitchen table, drinking lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug, when I opened my mom's text and felt my stomach drop. She said we needed to talk as a family, and that Emily is really hurt, and that I owed everyone an explanation. No context, no asking if I was okay. Just this scripted-sounding message that already assumed I was the problem. That's basically been the story of my life in my parents' house. Emily is the fragile victim, and I'm the one who needs to defend myself before I even know what I'm being accused of. By the time I finished reading the wall of text from my mom, my hands were actually shaking a little, and I realized I'd been clenching the phone so hard that my thumb hurt along the edge. I scrolled up and saw the timestamps. She had started texting around 7:15 a.m., which is early for her on a Sunday, so I already knew Emily had probably called her crying before the sun was even fully up. I stared at the kitchen window for a second. It was one of those gray Ohio mornings where the sky looks like a wet paper towel, just flat and colorless, and it matched exactly how that message made me feel. I could feel the old familiar frustration building up in my chest, that tight, burning feeling right behind the sternum that I get whenever I'm about to drive back to the house I grew up in. For a couple of minutes, I thought about ignoring it, pretending I didn't see the texts, but then my phone buzzed again, and it was my dad this time, saying, "Be here by noon." No question mark. No please. Just an order. I sat there at the table for another 10 minutes, absent-mindedly tracing a scratch in the wood with my fingernail, while my coffee went cold and my brain tried to connect the dots of what Emily could have said this time. The last big fight with her had been about money, of course. She'd asked to borrow $3,000 a few months ago just until her tax refund came in. And when I told her I couldn't do it because I was still paying off my own credit card debt, she called me selfish and said I didn't understand real responsibility because I don't have kids. She told my parents I refused to help in an emergency, and conveniently left out the part where she still hadn't paid back the $2,000 from the last emergency. Ever since then, things had been weird. My mom's voice got tighter when she talked to me, and my dad suddenly started making little comments about how family is supposed to help family. So when I read her text saying Emily was hurt and I needed to explain myself, I could practically hear the script already written against me. I finally got up, dumped the rest of the coffee into the sink, and just let the faucet run for a second longer than necessary, listening to the water hit the stainless steel like white noise while I tried to get my breathing under control. I tossed my mug into the drying rack, grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, and slipped on my worn-out sneakers that I keep telling myself I'll replace when I have extra money. My apartment hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's overcooked bacon, and as I locked the door, I had this weird moment of wishing I could just hide there, in that ugly hallway, instead of driving to face whatever story Emily had spun this time. But I walked down the stairs anyway, feeling that heavy, resigned feeling in my legs, like every step was a decision I didn't really want to make. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting my nose a little, and my car windshield was smeared with dried salt from last week's slush. The drive to my parents' place felt longer than 40 minutes. The highway was mostly empty, just a few beat-up sedans and pickup trucks, and the sky stayed that same depressing gray the whole way. I kept catching myself gripping the steering wheel too tight, my forearms tense, and then forcing myself to relax my hands like I was doing some kind of breathing exercise. I replayed every interaction with Emily from the past few months. The money request, the passive-aggressive comments in the family group chat, the way she had started posting vague quotes about toxic people on Instagram, and then liking my mom's comments underneath. None of it pointed to anything concrete, but I knew her pattern. First she cries to my parents. Then they call me in. Then I sit there in their living room feeling like I'm on trial, while Emily trembles and wipes fake tears with a tissue she doesn't actually use. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the whole scene looked too familiar. My dad's gray SUV in his usual spot, my mom's older sedan slightly crooked like she rushed in, and Emily's minivan parked right in front of the porch like she owned the place. The house itself still had the sad leftover pumpkins on the front steps, half collapsed and discolored, even though Thanksgiving had already passed. There was a cold wind pushing dead leaves around the yard, scraping them over the cracked concrete walkway. As I walked up to the door, I noticed the storm door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. My mom's nervous, higher-pitched tone and Emily's choked up, "I'm trying my best" voice that she uses when she wants sympathy. My stomach twisted. I wiped my hands on my jeans without even thinking about it, like I needed to get rid of some invisible residue before I walked in. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and cinnamon candles, which normally would feel homey. But today it just felt like they were trying too hard to make this look like a normal family Sunday. My mom was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel, even though nothing was cooking. She gave me this tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she was glad I came. But her voice didn't sound glad at all. Emily was sitting at the dining table with a box of tissues in front of her like a prop, and there were already a few crumpled ones scattered around. But I noticed her nose wasn't red and her eyes weren't actually puffy. My dad was in his usual spot on the couch in the living room, TV on mute, holding the remote like some kind of badge of authority. He glanced over his shoulder at me and nodded, but didn't say anything. The whole setup felt staged, like I'd walked into a play where everyone already knew their lines. My mom told me to sit down, so I pulled out the chair across from Emily at the dining table. The wood felt sticky, like it hadn't been wiped properly, and there were faint coffee rings near my elbow. The overhead light was a little too bright, making everything look harsher. Emily's perfectly done hair, the fresh coat of nail polish on her fingers, the way she clasped her hands like she was making sure her wedding ring was clearly visible. I noticed an open manila folder on the table near her, with a couple of folded papers sticking out, and my heart rate picked up again. My name was written on the tab in my mom's neat handwriting, and a cold wave of anger and fear washed over me before anyone even spoke. I suddenly felt like I was back in high school, sitting at this same table while they confronted me about some grade or some missed curfew, except now I was a grown man being summoned like a kid. Before anyone got to whatever that folder was, my mom started talking about how this has gone on long enough, and how we can't have tension like this at the holidays. She said Emily had been under a lot of stress, that the kids could feel the tension, that it wasn't fair to put them in the middle. She didn't mention my stress, or my tension, or my bills, or how I'd picked up extra shifts to pay off the credit card I'd maxed out helping Emily last year. She just painted this picture where Emily was drowning and I was standing on the shore watching. I sat there listening, feeling my jaw clench so tight I thought it might crack, while Emily dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue like she was in some low-budget drama. My dad stayed silent behind us in the living room, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. Eventually, my mom said Emily had something to share, and Emily pulled in a shaky breath that sounded rehearsed. She started talking about how she'd been in a really bad place financially, and how she had trusted me to help and felt abandoned when I didn't come through. She said it had put her in a position where she had to make choices she wasn't proud of. Every word was carefully chosen to make her sound responsible and me sound cold. I could feel heat creeping up the back of my neck, because I knew where this was going. She was about to tell them some version of events where I was the villain and my parents were going to eat it up like they always did. I glanced over at the manila folder again, wondering what was in there, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Then she reached for the folder and slid it closer to the middle of the table, her fingers lingering on the edge like she wanted to make sure I saw that it was evidence. She said something about being honest with the family and wanting everything to be clear, and my mom nodded enthusiastically like this was the bravest thing she'd ever seen. My dad finally spoke up from the living room and said we all needed transparency, which was funny coming from the man who never told us anything about his own money issues growing up. Emily opened the folder and pulled out a couple of printed pages, face down, and placed them in a neat little stack. I caught a glimpse of a bank logo in the corner of one, and my stomach flipped. I could actually hear my heartbeat in my ears for a second. She pushed the papers a little closer and said that after I refused to help her, she'd had to take drastic measures to cover a joint expense we supposedly had together. That was the first time that day where I genuinely had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't have any joint accounts with her. I didn't co-sign anything. The only thing I'd ever done was transfer her money through apps or hand her cash. I felt this weird detachment in my chest, like I was watching the scene from outside my body, because part of me couldn't believe we were going through this again, and another part of me wasn't even surprised. My mom picked up the stack of papers and held it like it was something radioactive, glancing at me with this disappointed look that made me want to either scream or laugh. She hadn't turned the pages over yet, and Emily just sat there, hands folded, looking down like she was ashamed. My dad muted the TV completely, the little red light on the cable box reflecting off the glass of the TV stand, and I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator kicking on in the kitchen. It's funny the things you remember in moments like that. The smell of coffee going slightly burnt on the warmer, the faint ticking of the old wall clock above the doorway, the way a piece of sunlight finally broke through the gray outside and hit the dust on the dining room table. Everything felt too sharp and too quiet at the same time, like the air in the room had thickened and we were all just waiting for something to explode. I knew whatever was on those pages was going to be the center of this talk, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what my sister had done. When my mom finally flipped the first page over, the room shifted in this strange way, like everyone leaned forward without actually moving. I saw her eyes narrow as she scanned whatever Emily had printed, and even though she didn't say anything right away, I could tell she didn't fully understand what she was looking at. My dad walked over from the living room and stood behind her, arms crossed, staring down at the page like he expected it to confirm something he'd already decided about me. I reached across the table and pulled the papers toward me before my mom could start lecturing. The printout showed a transaction history, supposedly from an account with both my name and Emily's listed at the top in bold. Except the middle initial was wrong. The address was wrong. Even the email address tied to it wasn't mine. It was some Gmail variation of my name that I'd never used in my life. The only thing correct was my first and last name, and even that looked like it had been typed separately from the rest of the header. My irritation sharpened into something colder as I flipped to the second page. It only got worse. The second page listed an overdraft fee from 2 months ago and a transfer to external account, labeled with a nickname I didn't recognize. Then, below that, a highlighted line showing that I had supposedly withdrawn $1,200 to cover Emily's car payment. I felt my jaw tighten again, but this time the anger burned in a way that felt almost clarifying. Emily kept her eyes down, but I could see her bouncing her leg under the table, her heel tapping lightly against the linoleum floor. My mom was already gearing up to say something emotional about trust and family, but I lifted my hand slightly without looking at her, signaling her to wait. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't even breathing heavily. I just felt this weird steadiness settle into my chest as I kept flipping through the papers, each one more ridiculous than the last. My dad finally asked, "What is this, Ryan?" In that tone he uses where he isn't asking for information so much as demanding a confession. I pushed the stack back onto the table so everyone could see the header clearly. I told them the account wasn't mine, the email wasn't mine, the address wasn't mine, and the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. My voice sounded strangely calm even to my own ears, almost disconnected from the heat simmering under my skin. I slid the paper with the signature across the table and pointed to the sloppy initials. They weren't even close to how I sign anything. My dad squinted at it like he was trying to convince himself it was still possibly me, but even he couldn't pretend it matched. My mom's face started to shift, the uncertainty creeping in around the edges of her frustration. Emily let out this tiny, shaky breath, and I saw her shoulders lift and drop in a way that made me instantly suspicious. She wasn't crying. She wasn't defending herself. She was stalling. My mom asked her, gently of course, if she was sure this was the right account, and Emily nodded a little too fast, wiping under her eye again even though there were still no tears. My dad asked where she got the printouts, and she said she had requested them from her bank because she didn't know what else to do. But her voice cracked on the last part like she was trying to inject emotion into a sentence she'd practiced. I just watched her, not saying anything, because for once I didn't feel the need to defend myself. The documents were so blatantly wrong that the truth was practically sitting in the middle of the table, waiting for someone besides me to acknowledge it. When I asked her directly what email she had used to supposedly share this account with me, she hesitated. It was small, but noticeable. She pressed her lips together and looked at my parents instead of at me, which told me everything I needed to know. I repeated the question, slower this time. Emily finally muttered something about, maybe the bank made a mistake, and I'm not good with this stuff. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. My dad's expression changed again, this time from stern to something more analytical, like he was replaying her wording in his head. My mom stopped fidgeting with the dish towel and set it down on the table, both hands flat, like she needed to ground herself. The room got quiet in a thick, uncomfortable way, and I could hear the faint clicking sound of the thermostat kicking on behind me. I leaned back in the chair and crossed my arms, letting the silence sit. For once, I wasn't the one scrambling to justify anything. Emily stared at the papers like she was trying to will them into making more sense. I asked her, still calmly, why she had printed only selective pages instead of a full statement. She blinked rapidly and said something about not wanting to invade my privacy, which made my dad raise an eyebrow. My mom asked her again where exactly she got the documents, this time less gently, and Emily said something vague about them being emailed to her. I pointed out, again calmly, that banks don't email full PDFs without security verification and that her story didn't add up. My mom's face tightened, and she glanced at my dad in that way she does when the narrative she was clinging to starts to come apart. Then I caught a detail that shifted everything. On the top right corner of one of the pages, one Emily clearly hadn't looked at closely, there was a faint watermark from an online template site. Not a bank watermark, a template watermark. I slid the page toward my parents and tapped the mark with my finger. My dad leaned closer, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. My mom actually gasped a little, pressing her hand to her chest. Emily's whole posture collapsed into this rigid, frozen position, like someone had hit pause on her. She didn't reach for the tissue box anymore. She didn't speak. She didn't even try to defend it. Just sat there staring at the watermark like she'd been caught stealing with both hands inside the drawer. My mom whispered something about, Emily, what is this? And the disappointment in her voice was sharp enough that even I felt it. My dad didn't say anything at first. He just kept staring at Emily with this mix of anger and disbelief. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence between all of us, marking each second of whatever unraveling was happening right there at the table. Emily swallowed hard, her throat visibly tightening, and her eyes darted around like she was searching for an escape route. She finally said she had been overwhelmed and panicked and didn't know how else to show them the truth. But her explanation didn't connect with anything real. It was like she was trying to glue a broken story back together with words that had no substance. My dad asked her directly if she had fabricated the documents, his voice low and controlled in that way he uses when he's furious but doesn't want to yell. Emily's chin trembled, but still no tears. She nodded slightly, barely visible, but enough. My mom exhaled sharply and sat back like someone had knocked the wind out of her. I didn't feel triumphant or relieved. I just felt tired. There was something incredibly draining about watching the whole thing unfold exactly how I expected, only this time with physical proof sitting inches from my hands. It made the past few years of being blamed automatically feel heavier and more pointless than ever. I leaned forward and rested my forearms on the table, looking at both of my parents instead of at Emily. I told them I didn't know what else to say, because I had been trying to tell them for years that Emily twisted things, but they didn't want to see it. My voice cracked a little, not out of emotion for her, but from the exhaustion of repeating the same pattern since childhood. My mom reached for the papers again, like she couldn't believe they were real. My dad finally stood up straight and stepped back from the table, rubbing his forehead like he had a migraine. Emily kept her eyes glued to the surface of the table, cheeks pale, lips pressed together so tight they were colorless. Just when I thought the worst moment had already passed, my mom asked Emily why she had gone to these lengths in the first place. There was no accusation in her voice anymore, just confusion mixed with hurt. Emily whispered that she needed help and felt ignored and didn't know how else to make us understand, which didn't explain anything but somehow made the tension even thicker. I could feel that cold clarity settling over me again, like I was seeing the full pattern at once for the first time. Emily wasn't sorry. She was cornered. And the only reason the lies were falling apart was because she'd made a mistake with a watermark. If she hadn't, I'd probably still be sitting there being scolded and blamed for things I didn't do. My dad finally sat back down, but he didn't choose his usual spot on the couch. Instead, he pulled out a chair at the table, directly across from Emily, and the shift in seating made the whole room feel different. It was like the balance of who they believed had finally tilted, even if none of them said it out loud yet. My mom kept smoothing the dish towel over her lap, like she didn't know what else to do with her hands, and the silence in the room went from tense to something almost brittle. I could hear the heating vents clicking on again, pushing lukewarm air into the room, and for a few seconds nobody spoke at all. My eyes drifted to the stack of fake documents still on the table, the edges slightly curled where Emily must have rushed printing them, and I wondered how long she'd been planning this. It wasn't impulsive. She'd spent time editing those templates, printing them, arranging them. This wasn't panic. This was calculation. When my dad repeated the question, "Why did she do this?" his voice had lost any softness. Emily finally looked up, but only briefly, before her gaze darted away again. She said she was desperate, that bills kept piling up, that the kids needed things, that her husband was between jobs again. She said she thought if she showed proof that I had abandoned her, my parents would step in financially the way they used to when we were kids. Every word sounded flimsy, like she was offering puzzle pieces from a different box. My mom shook her head slowly, like the explanation didn't match the weight of what she'd just seen. I didn't say anything. I realized I didn't want to argue or defend myself anymore. I didn't need to. The evidence had done the heavy lifting for me. But then my dad asked her something that snapped the room even tighter. "Did you use Ryan's name anywhere else?" The question hung in the air like humidity. Emily froze, and I saw her fingers curl slightly on the edge of the tissue box. She hesitated before answering, which was all the answer any of us really needed. My throat tightened as I waited, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears again. She finally said she had looked into options and thought about it, but claimed she never actually followed through with opening anything in my name. It wasn't convincing. Her voice got thinner with every word, like she could feel the floor sinking beneath her. I sat up straighter, feeling my chest get heavy in a different way. Fear instead of anger. Because now we weren't talking about fake printouts. We were talking about identity-level damage, and I had no clue how deep this went. My mom whispered my name, but not in the scolding way she usually did. This time it was soft, almost apologetic, like she suddenly realized how much she had overlooked. She turned to Emily and asked again, firmer, if she had ever used my information without permission. Emily didn't answer. She just sat there, lips pressed together, breathing shallow, her shoulders slightly hunched like she was bracing for impact. I watched my dad lean forward, elbows on the table, staring her down with a seriousness I hadn't seen from him in years. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was suspicion layered with something bordering on fury. The second hand on the wall clock ticked loudly between us. Then Emily finally said something that made the entire room feel smaller. She admitted she had applied for a store card in my name once, but claimed it didn't go through. She said it so quietly that for a second I wasn't sure I heard it right. My mom's hand flew to her mouth again, but this time she made a small sound like she had been slapped. My dad sat back, exhaling deeply, eyes closing for a moment like he was trying to process the magnitude of what his daughter had just confessed to. I felt a weird combination of numbness and adrenaline run through me. My hands felt cold. My face felt hot. And in the middle of it all, Emily reached for another tissue she didn't need, dabbing at dry eyes like she was the one being wronged. I asked her, very plainly, when she was planning to tell me. She didn't answer. She just shrugged in this helpless way that made something snap in me. Not anger, but clarity. All the years of tension, blame, favoritism, and excuses condensed into one clean thought. This wasn't an isolated moment. This was the result of a lifetime of everyone assuming I could take the hits because I didn't make noise about them. I felt my breath steady as I realized I wasn't here to convince anyone anymore. They were going to have to reconcile this themselves. My dad asked if anyone had actually contacted me about the attempt to open the card, and I said no, which meant either it didn't go far enough to trigger anything, or she used information that wasn't fully correct. Either way, it wasn't comforting. My mom looked at me with this mixture of heartbreak and guilt that I had honestly never seen from her before. She apologized, quietly, almost stumbling over the word, and said she didn't know Emily had taken it that far. It didn't fix anything, but hearing her say it felt like some wall had finally cracked open between us. Emily immediately started saying she was sorry too, but her apology felt mechanical, like she was following a script out of obligation rather than remorse. She talked about being overwhelmed, about being scared, about thinking the family would fall apart if she didn't handle things herself. None of it tracked. None of it addressed the core of what she did. My dad told her they'd figure out next steps, but his voice had an edge to it that made Emily look even smaller. The room still smelled like burnt coffee, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a smell so ordinary could sit over something that felt so big. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting so long in tension. My parents looked up at me as if waiting for some emotional outburst, but it never came. I just told them I needed air. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the cold hit me immediately, sharp against my face, but it felt good. Real. Grounding. The wind rustled through the dead leaves that had collected in the corner of the porch, making a soft scraping sound. I leaned on the railing and took a few long breaths, staring at the overcast sky as if it might offer some sense of direction. A couple minutes later, I heard the front door open softly behind me. It wasn't Emily. Her footsteps are sharper. It was my dad. He didn't say anything at first. He just came to stand next to me, leaning on the railing the same way I was. We stood there in silence, watching a neighbor drag a trash bin to the curb. Finally, he said he didn't know how bad things had gotten. His voice wasn't defensive or irritated. It was tired, honest. He said he should have asked more questions instead of assuming Emily was telling the truth. I didn't respond right away. I just kept watching my breath fog in the cold air. Hearing him acknowledge even a fraction of the pattern we'd all lived with felt surreal. He asked if I wanted them to take legal steps or report anything, and I told him I wasn't ready to think about that yet. I said I just needed them to stop treating me like the built-in scapegoat of the family. My dad nodded slowly, like that sentence hit him harder than anything else I'd said all day. He told me he understood, maybe for the first time ever, and said things were going to change inside that house. I didn't fully believe it, but I appreciated that he said it without hesitation. When I finally turned to go back inside, he didn't stop me or lecture me. He just followed quietly, his footsteps heavier than before, like he was carrying something new he hadn't expected to face today. When we walked back into the dining room, Emily was sitting alone at the table, shoulders curled inward, staring at the fake documents like they were going to rearrange themselves into something less incriminating. My mom had stepped away into the kitchen, probably to collect herself. The atmosphere felt different now, looser but also heavier. Emily looked up at me, her expression flickering between guilt and self-pity, but I felt strangely empty toward her. Not cruel, not victorious, just done, completely done. She opened her mouth like she wanted to explain more, but I sat down before she could speak and told her not to. There was nothing left to clarify. She had done what she did, and now we all had to live with what that meant. My mom eventually returned from the kitchen holding a glass of water, which she placed in front of Emily with the kind of automatic motherly gesture she couldn't turn off, even now. But the softness in her face was gone. She sat down beside my dad, not beside Emily, and that small shift said more than anything she could have verbalized. I sat across from them, feeling the hard wooden edge of the chair press into the back of my legs, grounding me. My mom asked me, gently this time, what I wanted to happen moving forward. The question didn't have an easy answer, and for a moment I just stared at the marks on the table where years of hot pans and coffee mugs had left faint discolorations. I told them I wasn't seeking punishment or revenge, but I needed boundaries. I needed them to stop assuming the worst about me every time Emily cried. As I spoke, I realized how long that sentence had been sitting inside me, unspoken. My dad nodded slowly, and for once he didn't look skeptical or tired of hearing complaints. He looked disappointed, but not in me. He turned to Emily and said she was going to have to take responsibility for what she'd done, really take it, not brush it off with excuses. He told her she needed to contact the bank Monday morning and confirm there were no accounts or applications floating out there with my name attached. The firmness in his voice jolted her, and she shrank back in her chair. My mom added that Emily needed to pay for any credit monitoring I set up in the meantime. I hadn't even thought about credit monitoring yet, but hearing my mom say it first made something shift inside my chest, like the ground had finally tilted in my direction after years of leaning the other way. Emily mumbled that she would do whatever it took, but the words came out thin and defeated. I didn't respond. I just looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, but with a sense of finality. Something in our relationship had snapped beyond repair, and I could feel the clean break in the silence between us. Instead of fueling guilt, it made me feel strangely calm. My mom, maybe trying to diffuse the atmosphere a little, suggested we take a break from family gatherings for a while, let things settle, give everyone some space. My dad agreed. Emily tried to protest, saying the kids shouldn't suffer, but my mom cut her off with a sharpness that surprised all of us. She said the kids would be fine and that this wasn't about them. Eventually, the room got quiet again, but it wasn't the tense, suffocating quiet from earlier. It was the quiet that happens after a storm breaks and the air finally shifts. Emily sat slumped in her chair, staring at the fake documents like she wanted to crawl inside them and rewrite everything. My parents stayed on their side of the table, having finally stepped out of the pattern they'd lived in for decades. As for me, I felt the exhaustion wash over my whole body, but under it there was something steadier. Not relief exactly. More like the start of a different chapter where I wasn't constantly carrying someone else's narrative on my shoulders. I stood up, feeling my joints crack lightly, and said I was heading out. No dramatic exit. No angry speeches. Just a simple statement that felt better than anything else I could have done. My mom walked me to the door, and for the first time in a long time, she hugged me without hesitation. Not a light pat on the back, not a half lean. A full embrace. She whispered that she was sorry again, and this time it sounded real, heavy, like she finally understood the years she hadn't been looking closely enough. When she pulled back, she looked different, tired, but clear. She told me she loved me and that things were going to change. My dad hovered behind her in the hallway, nodding in a way that made it clear he meant it too. Emily didn't follow us to the door. She stayed at the table. I didn't look back at her when I stepped outside into the cold air, and I didn't need to. As I walked to my car, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of someone's fireplace down the street. The sky was still gray, but a thinner kind of gray, like it was trying to break open. I sat inside my car for a minute before starting it, letting the heater blast stale, warm air around me. I looked at my phone, seeing a screen full of unread messages from a cousin I hadn't talked to in a while, someone who had quietly distanced himself from family drama years before I ever considered doing the same. Without thinking too hard, I texted him back. Just a simple message asking if he wanted to grab lunch sometime this week. He responded almost instantly, saying he'd been hoping I'd reach out. And in that moment, something inside me loosened. Driving away from my parents' house, I felt a strange mix of heaviness and lightness in my chest. What happened wasn't something you just shrug off. It wasn't something you forget. But something had shifted in my favor, even if it wasn't money or revenge or some dramatic payoff. I'd finally been believed. Not because I defended myself better, but because the truth was undeniable, and for once I didn't have to carry it alone. The road stretched out in front of me, wet from a light mist that had started while we were inside, and the reflection of the dull sky shimmered slightly on the asphalt. I didn't feel victorious, but I felt steady, and steady was something I hadn't felt around my family in years. When I got back to my apartment, the smell of the downstairs restaurant drifted through the vents again, but this time it didn't bother me. I kicked off my shoes, sat on the edge of my bed, and realized I felt something close to clarity. Emily's lies had finally broken under their own weight, and instead of being crushed underneath them, I'd watched them collapse from the outside. My parents had finally seen her for who she was. I hadn't won money or property or some dramatic inheritance, but I'd walked away with something I didn't think I'd ever get, the benefit of the doubt, and maybe even a slightly repaired relationship with my parents. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Before going to sleep, I set up credit monitoring like my mom suggested. Watching the confirmation email hit my inbox felt weirdly satisfying, like I was finally taking control of a story that had been spun around me for years without my input. I shut off the lights, crawled under my worn blanket, and listened to the hum of the building settling for the night. As I closed my eyes, I realized that even though the day had been draining and messy and tense, I had walked out of that house with something I'd never had before, proof that I wasn't the villain in my own family. And knowing that made the darkness of the room feel a little less heavy, like the air itself had given me just a little more space to breathe.